your contribution. We hope you will. We apologize for the fiasco with the buses at the start, but I want to commend everybody. Thank you for not complaining, getting to the vote on time, and I really think everybody had a great time. So thank you, and I know the staff thanks you for not complaining to them. Trust me, because they were a little freaked out yesterday when this all happened. But you guys did a great job. We really appreciate it. Today we have a packed day. We have some great speakers this morning. Then this afternoon, some of us are going to the Hill, where we're going to talk to our, hopefully our elected officials about, our issues, what we want from them, what we need from them in this continued climate of regulatory issues, especially with the new coal blocking and coal signaling that has really affected many of our member companies. So today, that's our chance. I think we had, I don't know, some like 30 meetings or 25 meetings scheduled today, so it's going to be a great day. I want to thank Nicole Erbar of Quicken Loans and Reed Houser from Psychel for putting this together, the whole Capitol Hill Council, so thank you for that. And you'll hear a lot more this morning as we go into some of the issues that we're actually going to discuss today on the Hill. So with that, we're fortunate this morning to have the Federal Communications Commission with us. They usually are here at our summit. We like to hear from the regulatory bodies, and Mark Stone, who's going to speak, has been here before and allows us to communicate with him, and we appreciate that. So to make this formal introduction, Dan Reiki from HER, responsible this morning. Please come on.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody coffeeed up? Good. My name is Dan Rickey. I've been a member of PACE now for 3 years. I work with the AGR Group. AGR Group is a company that has a suite of other companies who specialize in customer engagement through all marketing channels across the United States and Canada, both B2C and B2B. For 10 years, I have headed our mobile marketing, lead generation, and compliance arm at AGR called All Global Resources. And this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mark Stone, Deputy Chief, Consumer and Government Affairs Bureau of the FCC. His responsibilities include TCPA rulemakings and interpretations and other key consumer protection issues like truth in billing. Mark has worked in a number of FCC bureaus, including enforcement, wireline competition, and the Office of the Managing Director, as well as serving as a legal advisor to several FCC commissioners. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Mark Stone.
So when I first came in the room, Dan asked me what my passion was, and I said robocalls. And he frowned, because that was kind of a sad answer, right? So I said, it's like art, but robocalls is a little sad. So anyway, welcome, good morning, nice to see all of you here this morning. I wanted to, nice to be back again and talk TCPA stuff. Robocalls is really a big part of my life and TCPA implementation. So like a lot of things, the TCPA on the surface seems really simple. Just make sure you have prior express consent before you robocall or text someone. But as with a lot of things, it's actually a lot more complex. So if you know nothing about the substance of the TCPA, you probably do know there's a private right of action under the TCPA. You can get sued in court for it. So it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to what the FCC and courts are doing around the TCPA. So this morning I wanted to start off with a short overview of the TCPA's requirements, give a couple of words about the FCC's latest interpretations and enforcement. And then I want to focus on our latest efforts, which undoubtedly you've heard about, to combat robocalls, make sure that unwanted or illegal robocalls don't get to consumers at all in the first place. And so that includes call blocking and reassigned number methods. So first, a quick overview of the TCPA. And it all, oh, that's the right one. I'm just happy I got color on the slide. So what is a robocall? Well, if you're calling and leaving a pre-recorded or artificial voice message with a consumer on the landline phone, you made a robocall, but only if you're telephone to landline. On the other hand, if you leave those types of messages, pre-recorded artificial voice message, or use an automated dialer to call a consumer's cell phone, that's a robocall. So you can see robocall definition varies based on what you're calling about and based on the phone that you reach. And by the way, on cell phones, which you probably know, it doesn't matter if you're telemarketing or the content does not matter at all. So, when is it okay to make a robocall? Well, as I mentioned before, you have a consumer's prior express consent. If it is an emergency call, so things like a school emergency, a weather emergency, things like that, or if you've gotten an exemption from the FCC, which we do on a case-by-case basis. So how do you get consent? Well, it generally has to be in writing if it's in telemarketing, going back to that telemarketing, non-telemarketing distinction. If it's not telemarketing, either oral or in writing will do. And it has to be fairly explicit. The more explicit, the better. The more you tell the consumer what it is that they're signing up for, the better your consent is going to be in return for that. On the other hand, of late the Commission has acknowledged some practical realities. And the Commission has said sometimes when a consumer merely gives the phone number as contact information, that can be sufficient for prior express consent. So for example, if you give your phone number to your child's school as your contact number, that can be sufficient consent for calls that you might reasonably expect to get from your kid's school. Things like reminders about parent-teacher conferences, that sort of thing. On the other hand, if the school is calling to remind you about a fundraiser, that may not be within the scope of that consent. And so that's why the FCC often says be as explicit and clear as you possibly can. Okay, so back to what is a robocall in the first place. The first two categories I mentioned, pre-recorded and artificial voice messages, are fairly straightforward. That third category, auto dialer, again, that applies just to cell phones, but that is where a lot of the confusion comes in. What exactly is an auto dialer? We're dealing with a 1991 law, the TCPA, that tried to define equipment that was used back in 1991. Things have changed since then, and so there ends up being a lot of confusion around it. The Commission last interpreted what an auto dialer was in 2015. That is now pending before the DC Circuit, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about it other than to say kind of what the two sides of the argument are, which some of you may be very familiar with. Robocallers tend to say, look, we don't dial anymore randomly or sequentially. That may have been the case in cold calling in 1991. It's not the case now. Therefore, really none of the equipment we use today should be considered an auto dial. Consumer advocates, on the other hand, tend to say what really matters is whether the equipment has the potential to dial randomly sequentially, and by that definition, then most things are auto dialers. So you can imagine the two sides tend to stake out extreme positions. Either everything's an auto dialer, including your smartphone potentially, or nothing is an auto dialer. So moving beyond defining what exactly a robocall is, which robocalls we should be concerned about. I think about them in robocalls generally in three broad categories. The first category is the types of robocalls, and let me just acknowledge, not all robocalls is bad. I think of robocalls by the textbook definition that we have in the Act, the definition that we have in the FCC rules. I know for a lot of people out there, robocall is a very negative term. That's not how we perceive it. You understand robocalls are often an efficient way to get out the information the consumers really do want. So I think of robocalls kind of in three separate categories. One is the types of robocalls we all want to get. Again, your kid's school calling to remind you about a parent-teacher conference or a weather emergency, something like that. The second category are the types of robocalls we might want today, but not tomorrow. So think a robocall from your pharmacy that you got a prescription at a couple of years ago, reminding you now it's flu season, come on in and get a flu shot. You might want it one day, you might not want it another. And then the third category is the dreaded Rachel calls, card services. Nobody wants that ever, and those are the types of calls that are highly likely to want to defraud you. So the prospect of the deterrent effect of TCPA liability, FCC enforcement, is really only good for those first two categories. Those first two categories are made by responsible entities that really are going to try to be observant of the law, be respectful of consumer rights. That third category, Rachel card services, TCPA liability is not a deterrent, right? They've got bigger problems. If we catch them, then it's anti-fraud laws, it's potential criminal responsibility, that sort of thing. So the FCC then has got to start thinking about different types of tools that we can use to stop those worst of all robocalls before they ever reach the consumer. So one of the techniques that we've looked into is caller ID spoofing. So the really bad, the rich regard services robocallers obviously aren't going to disclose their true caller ID. Caller ID is easy to fake or spoof. It's very easy to fake. And so these worst of all robocallers to spoof their caller ID, sometimes they use caller ID that is going to really lure a consumer into picking the phone up and thinking this is a trusted entity. So the best example is the IRS scam, where the bad callers spoof the IRS's number. Consumers think this is a trusted source. They're going to pick it up. They're going to tell that bad robocaller their information, thinking this is the U.S. government. So the FCC has moved to codify or put into place what we call a do not originate list, which would be where entities like the IRS have phone numbers. They legitimately have phone numbers. If they don't make any outbound calls from at all, they can put those numbers on a do not originate list, and then the voice providers will know when a call comes across the network that purports to be from that number, this is bogus. There's no way this is a legitimate call. So we have to be careful about that, right? We have to make sure that this is a good list. We have to make sure that it's really the IRS telling us to block these sort of calls. But it's a good idea, and it's one that we think will really help consumers that if they get a call that looks like it's a legitimate call or one that they can trust, they're much more likely to be defrauded. So we think do not originate is a good idea. The second category of calls that the FCC has proposed to allow voice providers to block are calls from numbers that are invalid, numbers that can exist under our North American numbering plan. So that's the type of call that comes across your phone is from a 000 area code. Really no legitimate way that we can think of or reason that anyone would make a call from this sort of thing. And then the third category of numbers are numbers that might be legitimate, but have yet to be assigned to any consumer. So this is the type of call, again, if it comes from this caller ID, highly likely to be spoofed. We can't think of a legitimate reason that someone would call using caller ID that hasn't even been assigned to any consumer yet. And then the fourth category, which you all are probably very interested in, is the Commission has asked, are there other objective bases that would indicate to voice providers that a number is highly likely to be spoofed and highly likely to be fraudulent? So one example might be if there's a phone number that's assigned, it's legitimate and it's assigned, and the phone number maybe makes 1 or 2 calls a day, all of a sudden makes 1,000 calls within 5 minutes. Is that the kind of thing that we should say, hey, voice providers, it's okay to block that because it's highly likely to be fraudulent? Now, as you can imagine, we have to be really, really careful about this sort of thing. We have to be very careful about giving the carrier's license to block calls. The FCC has a long-standing history of encouraging call completion. Networks work best when calls are actually completed, when consumers and callers can have confidence that the call is going to go through. So the Commission has tried to move very slowly and deliberately, has asked for public comment in multiple stages on these sort of questions. Again, trying to balance, making sure that good calls go through, but that we are able to be thoughtful about call blocking, about the worst types of the calls that come through. So we've asked, for example, if a good call gets caught up in the bad call net somehow, mistakenly gets caught up, how can we remedy that? Is there a quick mechanism to ensure that a good caller who's gotten caught up in that net can tell its voice provider or consumer's voice provider, hey, you caught me, I'm not a bad guy, please allow my calls to go through. So we're very interested in that. We've asked how that sort of process might work. And so that's going to be a big part of what we're doing going forward. So you might ask for both wireless consumers and landline consumers, what about apps to block calls? Aren't apps sufficient? It's a good question, and I think apps have gotten better over time. However, apps are just as susceptible to caller ID spoofing as the voice providers themselves. So if I've got a good app on my phone today that by virtue of crowdsourcing knows to block a call that's coming to my phone today, that's great. But tomorrow, if that same evil robocaller moves to another number, my app's not going to catch that necessarily. So apps are good, but they're imperfect. So moving away from call blocking for a moment, another big area that we're working on is reassigned phone numbers. So reassigned phone numbers, as the name suggests, as you're probably all familiar, a lot of times consumers will switch to phone numbers, particularly wireless phone numbers. And so the robocall problem then is that if I give my consent to a robocaller on my phone today, and then tomorrow I give my phone number up, and I don't tell the robocaller, hey, I'm going to be at a new number. And then the phone company reassigns that number to you tomorrow. That means the robocaller is going to make a call that you don't want to you, and I'm going to miss a call that I wanted, and the robocaller is going to be frustrated because they haven't reached the person they want. So the commission, this has been a long-standing problem. It's one of those cases where we rarely see at the FCC where there seems to be a lot of support for a solution to the problem. So the commission has asked if it should establish a thorough, comprehensive reassigned numbers database. And so the commission has asked whether it should be something that's FCC administered, should we put it in place and administer it, or should we leverage the existing commercial databases that are already out there and seem to be doing pretty good work. The commission has asked which voice providers should report into the reassigned numbers database. Is it just wireless, should it be landline, should it be VoIP, those sort of questions. So again, this is a big deal. This is an idea that's been percolating for a while, and we're pretty excited about it. Again, it goes to the idea of stopping the alarm robocall before it gets to the consumer's phone. In this case, it's where there's a reassignment. In the previous cases, it's blocking before it goes over the voice provider's network when we think that's highly likely to be fraudulent. Finally, I mentioned the idea, the issue of caller ID spoofing. It's very easy to do. It's inexpensive. To be clear, there are certainly good uses of caller ID spoofing where there's legitimate reason, good public policy reason to have a caller mask their identity. But because spoofing exists, our efforts are sort of imprecise at trying to use the spoofing to block calls that are highly likely to be fraudulent. There's always a chance that we're going to end up catching good calls up in that net. So the good news is there is a longer term solution that would cut through all of this, and that's called call authentication. So think of this as like a fingerprint. There we go. Think of this as a fingerprint for a call, or think of it as if I have my driver's license in my hand, you being able to check with the DMV right away to say, does the driver's license that he has, does his caller ID truly represent who he is? So call authentication is something that would leverage the migration of networks from old style copper networks to new IP networks. When we transition to IP, we're able to pack a lot of information about a call into the call itself, into the header. And so what that means is we can pack information that gives the true origin and travel path of the call so that we know it's not been spoofed. And so the commission has asked how we can facilitate this call authentication. So once we're there, that means when a consumer gets a call, the caller ID that's displayed is going to be legitimate. There's no faking it. And so that means they'll know whether it's actually the IRS, they'll know whether it's a legitimate telemarketer, they'll know whether it's a bank. And if it ends up being an unwanted illegal robocall, it's easy to report. They know exactly what the originating number is. That makes both blocking and enforcement a lot easier. So, as I mentioned, this becomes easier, becomes a possibility when all networks are transitioned to Internet Protocol or IP. We're not there yet, even though the FCC has encouraged it, and you have VoIP providers, people routinely subscribe to. Large chunks of the network that a call can go through are not yet IP. A lot of them are traditional old style copper or what we call TDM networks. If any part of that call path is not IP, we lose that call data that goes out. Spoofing is then enabled. And so there's two parts to get into the promised land of call authentication. One is having networks that are fully IP. And then the second one is making sure the industry has standards around what that call authentication system would look like. So the phone industry has been working hard at this, but it's complex. We work with a lot of industry standards bodies at the FCC, and it's a difficult process, even when everything's well-intentioned, to get everyone to sort of agree what the proper standards are. So the FCC recently asked, what can we do now? We're not looking necessarily to mandate standards. We're not necessarily experts on standards, but what can we do to kind of facilitate things? So we specifically asked if we should, how we can facilitate or otherwise encourage adoption of call authentication standards, and asked about the relevant timeframes and milestones that we should consider as we do that. So up until this moment, I've been talking largely forward-looking FCC work. How should we clarify to enable proper call blocking? How should we think about reassigned numbers? Should we establish a database? But a lot of our efforts on illegal robocalls are backward-looking, namely enforcement. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of our more recent enforcement actions for you. In August, we proposed an $82 million fine against an individual and his companies. One of them was named Best Insurance Contacts, that apparently made 21 million illegally spoofed calls in violation of the Truth and Caller ID Act. So I should have mentioned that in addition to the TCPA, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, we also administer the Truth and Caller ID Act. The Truth and Caller ID Act is less concerned about the definition of a robocall. That's what the TCPA is all about. The Truth and Caller ID Act focuses more on that spoofing part. And so what the Truth and Caller ID Act says that if you are spoofing a number, if you're putting fake caller ID in, and your goal is to defraud consumers or harm them, then you can be liable. And so that's what our August work on this particular fine was all about. And then in June, the Commission proposed a $120 million fine against any individual against an individual that was responsible for 96 million spoof calls during a 3-month period. Good thing used an automatic. My answer is yeah, I did not use an automatic for that. And so, so the interesting thing about this case is that he spoofed the calls to trick unsuspecting consumers into answering advertising messages that appear to come from local numbers. So this is a different type of spoofing that sometimes people refer to as neighborhood spoofing or neighborhooding. So that's the type of spoof where it comes in from what looks like a local area code. It may seem like, oh, this is legitimate, maybe it's a neighbor, or maybe it's a local business, something like that. So going back to what I said before about trusted numbers, IRS numbers, that sort of thing, neighborhood spoofing can be the same sort of thing. It can lure consumers into thinking this is a legitimate person. But when the consumer picked up that phone call, the messages purported to be about vacation deals from well-known travel and hospitality companies such as Marriott, Expedia, Hilton, and TripAdvisors. And then when they answered, they were sent to foreign call centers where live operators attempted to sell them vacation packages offering timeshares. So finally, in July, we issued a nearly $3 million fine against a company called Dialing Services for facilitating unwanted robocalls. So robocallers use Dialing Services call technology platform to make millions of illegal robocalls to mobile phones. This wasn't telemarketing. Remember the distinction I said earlier, if you're calling to a landline phone, you only worry about the robocall law if you're telemarketing. On the other hand, if it's the wireless phone, it doesn't matter if it's telemarketing or not. This was a case of wireless phones, non-telemarketing. So this actually was notable because the Commission made clear that a third party, such as a platform provider of robocalls, may be liable under the TCPA if that third party is so involved in the placement of the call that it essentially made the call. So this was a little bit groundbreaking for the FCC and enforcement. We had written new rules of clarifications in 2015 and tried to talk about this a little bit. It's not that the FCC doesn't encourage good uses of third-party platform robocall providers. If I'm starting my own pizza company and I don't want to get in the robocalling business, it would be great if I could hire or use a cloud service to get on my robocalls. But what the Commission said is be cautious if that third party, that platform provider is essentially making the call, if it's providing suggested phone numbers, if it's facilitating caller ID spoofing, if it's so involved in the call that platform provider should be liable as well. So that was a little bit of groundbreaking enforcement action and one to keep your eye on. So before I wrap up, I want to get in a quick plug for my FCC colleagues that are here today as well. Another project we're working on that's not related to robocalls, but is still pretty exciting, is promoting a service called direct video communication for business and government call centers that receive calls for people with disabilities who use American Sign Language. The service allows a deaf or hard of hearing person to have a one-on-one or direct video communication with the center. So we're excited about the technology. I know they're set up in the lobby, so has nothing to do with robocalls, but if you wouldn't mind checking them out, that would be great. So that sort of completes my overview. I covered a lot of territory. really, really quickly, and I know that you all will undoubtedly have questions about blocking, and maybe reassign numbers, and then sort of the bedrock TCPA law, which I'm happy to answer. The one thing I want to caution you on is, while I'm happy to answer any questions, as I was discussing with Michelle, because we have a lot of issues currently pending before us. All the blocking stuff is pending before the FCC to reassign numbers, the call authentication stuff. That means if you take an advocacy position with me, if you say, Mark, the FCC should do X, unfortunately that's an ex parte, and you've got to enter that into the record. And so there's probably great ways for Michelle and others to coordinate with that, but just be aware. By contrast, if you're just asking me questions, doing kind of a little bit of background for your own edification, that's no problem, that's not an ex parte, but if you take an advocacy position, then that is an ex parte. So that wraps up my overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Good, just good to get in front, Chris.
Thank you, and thank you for your time this morning. And just a quick question, I guess your opinion, if you have a customer database with wireless numbers in there, and the robocalls information will say a recall of the product, is that copacetic to be able to call those individuals and leave those messages?
So are these numbers from consumers that have consented to get robocalls from you? Yeah, then that, yes. Again, going back to my point, the more explicit you are when you get that consent, the better. So ideally, in a perfect world, you would have said, hey, by giving me your phone number, you consent to get calls about any sort of issue related to this product or service, up to and including, rebate recall information. As a practical matter, we understand that's not always how it works, but the more explicit, the better. That said, as I mentioned before, sometimes the commission has said that sometimes the mere giving of a phone number is contact information can be sufficient for calls that consumers might reasonably expect. And under your scenario, it seems like a consumer might reasonably expect and welcome a call about a product recall. But these tend to be very fact specific, so it's hard to kind of answer the question in the abstract. But our encouragement is always try to be as explicit as you can when you obtain a consumer's express consent.
Which of the, are you just talking to the major voice service providers, or do you have an open forum with all those voice providers subject to the, or specific to the do not originate list?
Yeah, so, yes, I hope I answered the question that I think you asked. If I didn't, let me know. So yeah, the idea of do not originate and some of the other blocking things that the FCC has asked about have their genesis, and a lot of the voice providers work under the robocall strike force, which was an industry collaboration that we kept monitoring, but largely was driven by industry. And so they came up with some ideas, they put it in a report, they asked the FCC to try to clear any regulatory underbrush to facilitate it, and one of those was do not originate. So all the major providers seem to be on board with do not originate. Indeed, one of their umbrella organizations called US Telecom has sort of taken the lead at this point, sort of compiling the list. So, but you raise a good point. For do not originate to work, the providers have to have buy-in. There has to be a list that everyone agrees is the right list, and then all the providers who will handle a phone call along the call path have to have access to that, and each one of them has to have the ability to block. So we're optimistic. A lot of stuff that we do at the FCC is controversial. We don't think do not originate is terribly controversial, hopefully. So we sense buy-in from the major voice providers, consumer groups. It's hard to argue with the notion that if the IRS isn't making calls from this number, that it's probably bogus. So in the spectrum of robocall issues, non-controversial, I think. On the other end, there are the more difficult questions about blocking. So I hope that answers your question.
Good, thank you.
Question, just over the last couple of days, there's been a new term that I don't think is in the statute as far as I know, but we've heard it a few times now. It's
Initiative tomorrow to address some of those very issues on how to mitigate the adverse impacts of blocking. Obviously, we invite you or any of your staff to join us. But my question pertains to call blocking. Some of the scammers are now doing a spoofing technique called mirroring. similar to neighboring, where instead of using a slight variation of the call number, they'll actually use the call number as the calling number. I guess at some point, spoofers or scammers will start using maybe FCC or other government numbers. How are the blocking providers supposed to address those types of instances? Because people won't want to report their own numbers for blocking.
Yeah, that's a good question. My honest answer is I'm not sure. I think that's a really terrific question, and amongst all the other blocking questions that we have before us, one that's got to be involved. I mean, this is tricky territory. The robocall, illegal robocall problem is a massive problem, as you all know, and it affects not just consumers, but the good robocallers, right? I mean, I get 5 calls a day on my phone I don't recognize. I just don't want to pick them up because I think they're just bad robocallers. That's bad for me, that's bad for you, and so it's a solution. There needs to be a solution, and so that's why the commission has said, hey, look, is there a way to cut these off before they ever reach the consumer? And we're starting with the most obvious cases that I mentioned before, the types of spoofing that clearly are bogus. As we get into the questions that you're teeing up, we're going to have to move very, very slowly and delicately and carefully. Some have argued that, well, if you cut off the IRS spoofing calls, you're just going to cause the callers to move to more legitimate numbers, right? Or not more legitimate numbers, but like the neighborhood numbers and stuff like that. And that's a good counterpoint. One answer to that is, well, even if it looks like neighborhood spoofing, maybe some consumers are slightly less likely to pick that call up and trust that entity on the other line than if it were, for example, the IRS. So these are sort of gradations. We're slowly wading into the waters of call blocking, trying to be very careful and thoughtful. But I mean, as you all know, illegal robocalls are the #1 consumer problem that we hear about at the FCC. And that's not just 1 year, that's like every year. Guaranteed, one way to lose friends is to tell them you're a robocall lawyer at the FCC. They will say, what is wrong with you? Why aren't you doing more about this? So it's a massive problem. So again, we're trying to go thoughtfully into those waters to introduce blocking. But something more has to be done. I think everyone agrees on that. So.
Mark? Oh, yeah. We had talked earlier, gave you a couple of anecdotal issues. Just as an observation from our members, the blocking has gone into effect already, and you said you're very careful. We might look at it as not being that careful yet, because some calls are being blocked and legitimate, and the damage is already done. Mitigation after the fact means we have a revenue loss. A consumer, on the other hand, might have didn't get a notice about a trip, a prescription, or something, so they've already been harmed. So, do you have any idea how long? I know that the authentication was, I guess it's with shaking and stirring is the thing. How long will that take? And would the commission consider a moratorium on call blocking now until the real solution, which is authentication, comes into play?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mentioned before that shaken and stir is part of it. For those that don't know, it's a big part of the standards I mentioned before about call authentication. I'm not entirely sure what time period they're looking at for that. Again, there's 2 dimensions. One is coming up with the standards, having them tested, having all the providers feel good that they're effective and able to work. The other part is, again, you got to have an IP network end-to-end to have that call authentication information pass all the way through to the end recipient. So one thing that we know is that they've accelerated the process of those standards. I mentioned the industry robocall strike force. One great product from them is they accelerated things by about 6 months or so. Even with that, my sense is we're not talking months, we're talking years potentially. So there's some time frame now in the development of standards. And that's why I think the FCC is sort of acknowledging these things do take time. We have to be careful about it, make sure there's agreement. You see the FCC asking what it can do to help, so that's since the FCC is trying to say, come on, we know you got to be careful, we know this takes time, but this really is the silver bullet, right? This call authentication, so that's where you see that. Would the FCC consider a moratorium? I think the FCC is open to any suggestions. We are going carefully, as I mentioned several times before, and certainly if you think that's a good idea, I would encourage you to put it in the record. I would also encourage you at the same time to say that, there can be, if you believe this, there can be a moratorium in place while we're more thoughtful about blocking, but it would be time defined or time limited, because I think the commission is excited about some of these blocking proposals.
That's it.
Hi, sorry it's me again. Does the commission see a difference between labeling and blocking?
Yes, I think blocking, I know blocking is something that is a step that in some cases can be illegal, right? So as I mentioned before, the commission has a long-standing policy and rules around ensuring that calls are completed. The moment that you block a call, you deliberately block a call, you potentially have violated the rules unless there's an exception. And an exception here might be, you have a good reason to think that the call is fraudulent. Labeling, I don't think the commission has ever taken a legal position on labeling. So for example, if your concern might be, it's not that provider's blocking, it's that a provider or someone else is labeling a call inaccurately. If the call is for a product recall, but it's mislabeled as telemarketing, or that's not something the FCC has really inquired about in the past, to my knowledge, because again, our focus is on the blocking side and the legality of that. That's not to say that if folks introduce questions into our record about proper labeling, that the FCC wouldn't take account of that. Off the top of my head, being a lawyer, often wonder would we have jurisdiction, what could we say about that? So I'm not entirely sure about that.
I mean, the FCC's position has always been for the network to be open and for the calls to complete. And so the FCC at this point doesn't see labeling, like example you gave, recall and it comes up as a robocall.
Yeah.
That's not something that's in the sites or in the...
It's not, we have not teed it up as a question in our proceedings. That's not to say we wouldn't be interested. So as I said with other stuff, if there's a problem or a concern that hasn't been teed up, we'd love to hear about it. Because it does seem like an important, it sounds a little bit like spoofing. It's not exactly spoofing, but it could potentially be that. Or it could be the other way around. It could be spoofing or it's a call that in either direction that is misleading a consumer into something. So I think we'd be interested in it. The reason I'm drawing a distinction between blocking and labeling is, again, I think our authority is pretty focused on the actual blocking of all that.
I mean, the elephant in the room is obviously T-Mobile's embedded a labeling service in their mobile devices, right? So a lot of people in this room have clear examples of calls that they received that are mislabeled.
Yeah.
And so that at this point, that's not something that's in the purview or be looked at as part of this.
So it's not, because again, our focus has been blocking, but we would love to hear about that. I have heard about that and similar initiatives. What I've honestly heard less about is stuff that's mislabeled. So we would love to hear more about that, because that does go to the robocalls problem, separate and apart from what our authority might be to regulate labeling. I try to be very cautious in saying we got authority or not, and I don't know.
Mark, can I follow up on that question? When some of the mislabeling comes up, which actually blocks the true caller ID that the seller is trying to get out there,
Got it.
is that a violation of the True Caller ID Act?
You're asking me to render that decision up here on the table?
I thought you had to sit and vote, those.
Maybe. It's something I'd have to take back, but whether or not it is, and whether or not we would have authority, it's certainly a relevant point. Even if we haven't teed up that immediate issue, it is part of the larger question of consumers getting lured into calls they don't want to receive, or conversely, are they getting deterred from calls that they actually do want to receive? So again, happy to talk more about it, but I can't tell you for sure.
Any last questions? All right, well, Mark, thank you very much for your time
Thank you
today.
all.
We really appreciate it.